history remembers Henry VIII as a ruler of immense power. A king whose decisions reshaped the very fabric of England. A man who defied the Pope, shattered the Catholic Church's hold, married 6 times, and executed 2 of his queens. A figure larger than life, brash, commanding, seemingly invincible. But few know the real story of how he died, alone, decaying, and ultimately, human. Henry's image, cast in portraits of regal splendor, conceals a darker truth. Beneath the layers of velvet and gold, behind the jeweled crown and the royal decree, there was a body breaking down. A mind unraveling. A man at war not with foreign enemies, but with his own flesh. This is not the story taught in classrooms or enshrined in history books lined with dynasties and dates. This is the story of a body rotting from the inside out, a spirit crushed under its own weight, a monarch whose immense power could not delay the inevitable. In this episode of History's Horror, we strip away the myth of Henry VIII to confront the mortality that stalked him in his final years. We will dive into the disease, the isolation, and the grotesque details of a royal death that no one wanted to remember, but no one could truly erase. This is the horrible death of Henry VIII. Henry VIII's final battle did not take place on a battlefield, but within his own body. In the last decade of his life, the mighty king, once famed for his athleticism and commanding presence, became a shadow of his former self. The vibrant man who jousted, hunted, and danced was slowly consumed by crippling illness and the relentless decay of his health. By the early 1540s, Henry began to suffer from a series of mysterious ailments. What started as painful ulcers and swelling in his legs soon worsened into debilitating wounds that refused to heal. These sores, likely caused by severe obesity combined with diabetes and possibly venereal diseases, turned into festering, infected masses that oozed pus and festered with maggots. It was a horrifying spectacle, a monarch so swollen that he could barely move, weighed down by at least 400 pounds. But physical pain was only part of Henry's torment. The psychological toll was immense. Known for his fiery temper and volatile moods, the king's mental state deteriorated alongside his body. The once confident ruler became paranoid, suspicious of everyone around him, even his closest advisors and his own children. His isolation grew as his health worsened, cutting him off from court and family, leaving him trapped inside a decaying fortress of flesh and fear. Ironically, the power Henry wielded for decades could not stave off the slow betrayal by his own biology. Here was a man who had torn a nation apart to secure his throne and legacy, yet his greatest enemy was a combination of disease and time. No amount of royal decree could command healing or postpone death. His final years were marked by an escalating downward spiral. His beloved wives were dead or discarded, his heirs uncertain, and his empire shifting beneath his feet. The once mighty Henry was now confined to his bedchamber, battling wounds that crawled with insects, haunted by paranoia, and haunted by the creeping certainty that his reign, and his life, were nearing their brutal end. This was a king undone not by foreign armies or political rivals, but by the slow, merciless erosion of his own body and mind. Henry VIII's body began to betray him in ways as horrific as they were relentless. The king who once towered over courtiers and kings alike became imprisoned by his own flesh, a grotesque prison of swelling, wounds, and unbearable pain. The ulcers on his legs were no ordinary sores. They festered with infection, becoming grotesque open wounds that refused to heal. Accounts from his physicians described the skin breaking down into deep, festering ulcers, some reportedly infested with maggots, living organisms feasting on decaying flesh. Imagine the horror of a man forced to lie still, day after day, as these grotesque creatures crawled where only a king's touch should ever dare. The stench alone would have been overwhelming, filling the chambers with a sour reminder of mortality. Despite the agony, Henry's physicians were powerless. Medical knowledge in the 16th century was limited, and the king was left to suffer. His legs, swollen to twice their normal size, were said to be so large and painful that he could hardly sit comfortably or even sleep. The weight gain alone, pushing him past 400 pounds, made movement almost impossible. His pain was often accompanied by fevers and chills, classic signs of infection running rampant through his body. Some historians believe he may have also suffered from diabetes, which, combined with his wounds, created a deadly cycle of infection and decay. The king's once robust figure was now a tragic monument to physical decline. Yet the physical decay was matched, if not surpassed, by a terrifying mental collapse. Henry's mind, once sharp and cunning, became clouded by paranoia and despair. He grew distrustful of everyone, fearing conspiracies from courtiers, advisors, and even family members. This psychological decay manifested in fits of rage and episodes of deep isolation. Many of his closest allies were cast aside or executed, victims of his spiraling suspicions. Hallucinations and nightmares reportedly haunted his final years, with the king seeing enemies where none existed and fearing betrayal at every turn. His mood swung wildly, one moment raging with imperial fury, the next crumpled into fearful silence. Modern medical experts have speculated that Henry may have suffered from a form of vascular dementia, possibly triggered or worsened by his infections and lifestyle, adding a tragic neurological dimension to his suffering. This was a man trapped in a failing body and a fracturing mind, a terrifying collapse that no throne or crown could halt. The king, who once commanded armies and shaped nations, was now at the mercy of wounds, worms, fever, and his own haunted psyche. As Henry VIII's body and mind deteriorated, the world around him did not pause in solemn sympathy. It moved on, prepared to replace him, to rewrite his legacy, and to secure the future of the English throne. Within the corridors of power, political factions began to maneuver with quiet urgency. The king's illness was no secret, though the public remained largely in the dark, shielded by carefully controlled courtiers and advisors. Behind closed doors, nobles and ministers whispered of succession, alliances, and the fate of the realm once Henry's mighty grip finally loosened. Henry's only legitimate son, Edward, was still a child, barely 9 years old at the time of his father's decline. His two daughters, Mary and Elizabeth, were embroiled in religious and political tensions, a reflection of the kingdom's own fractured identity after the king's break with Rome. Each faction sought to position itself favorably, ready to influence or control the young heirs and the throne itself. Meanwhile, Henry's family life was fractured and distant. His wives were dead or estranged, Catherine of Aragon and Anne Boleyn both executed, Jane Seymour died shortly after childbirth, and of Cleves divorced, Catherine Howard executed, and Catherine Parr, his final queen, spent much of his decline managing the impossible task of caring for a dying man and the volatile court. His children were kept largely away from his presence, partly for their own protection, but also because his condition was as humiliating as it was terrifying. Courtiers shielded the public from the grotesque reality of their king's decline, maintaining the illusion of strength and continuity. The once imposing monarch was now a secret kept behind thick palace walls and whispered rumors. Despite the political games and family distance, Henry's paranoia fueled further isolation. He trusted fewer and fewer people, often accusing those closest to him of plotting against his life or legacy. His health and mind became weapons used by rivals, and his advisors juggled loyalty with survival. Outside the palace, the common people went about their lives, unaware of the slow decay of their ruler. Royal proclamations continued, festivals were held, the machinery of government still functioned. But beneath this surface, the heart of England was crumbling with its king. In these final years, Henry VIII was a monarch surrounded by scheming courtiers, a distant family, and a kingdom poised on the edge of transformation. His suffering was private, even as the stakes for the nation grew ever higher. By the time death came for Henry VIII, it was less a grand farewell befitting a king, and more a quiet, grim mercy, a release from relentless suffering. In the closing days of January 1547, the once towering monarch lay confined to his bed in the Palace of Whitehall, a massive, swollen figure draped in rich silks and heavy furs, but barely able to move. His face, once proud and commanding, was pale and sunken, his breath shallow and labored. The stench of festering wounds permeated the chamber, a cruel reminder that even a king's wealth could not keep decay at bay. Around him gathered the few who remained, his sixth wife, Catherine Parr, devoted and steady, trusted courtiers, and physicians, who could do little beyond offer comfort. There was no heroic last stand or fiery proclamation, only silence, broken by the labored rasp of Henry's breathing and the occasional whispered prayers. His body, bloated and scarred, was a grotesque shadow of its former self. The chronic ulcers on his legs were raw and weeping, sometimes crawling with maggots as described by his doctors, an image almost unimaginable for a man who once commanded the loyalty of thousands. The sheer physical agony was beyond comprehension, yet the king endured it until the end. In his final moments, Henry reportedly showed flashes of clarity and acceptance. Some accounts speak of him urging his advisors to ensure the succession of his son Edward, aware that his legacy and kingdom would soon be entrusted to another. But these moments were fleeting, swallowed quickly by weakness and the final wave of pain. His death was a stark and humbling reminder: no matter the crown, no matter the power, the end comes for all. The mighty king, who had once crushed enemies with sword and law, now lay helpless and frail, simply human. And when his heart finally stopped beating, it was not in a blaze of glory, but in quiet stillness, a mercy that released him from the unbearable torment of a body failing beyond repair. This final scene was raw and unvarnished, a moment that stripped away all illusions of grandeur, exposing the tragic vulnerability beneath the royal facade. The story of Henry VIII's death was quickly rewritten, or buried beneath layers of political necessity and royal propaganda. To the Tudor court, the grotesque reality of the king's final days was a dangerous truth, one that could weaken the monarchy's image and destabilize the realm. Official accounts painted a sanitized picture. Henry died a strong and resolute king, calm in his final hours, surrounded by loyal family and advisors. The maggot-infested wounds, the unbearable odors, the swelling and immobility, they were quietly omitted from the royal narrative, deemed too horrific and undignified to share. Portraits commissioned after his death deliberately emphasized strength, majesty, and control. Artists glossed over the physical decline with layers of symbolism, armor shining, faces serene, postures commanding. The stark reality was replaced with myth-making, ensuring Henry's legacy remained untarnished by the mortal decay that had consumed him. Documents that detailed his illnesses were suppressed or altered. Medical records were vague or misleading, and courtiers' letters were censored to maintain the illusion of royal vitality. The king's suffering was hidden behind palace walls, locked away from the eyes of the public and future generations. Even Henry's tomb reflected this sanitization. His final resting place in St. George's Chapel at Windsor Castle is grand and imposing, but does not reveal the grotesque struggle that preceded it. Instead, it immortalizes the king as a monumental figure, powerful, eternal, and untouchable by human frailty. This erasure speaks to a broader historical pattern: the deaths of great rulers often sanitized to protect dynastic stability and political power. Yet beneath the surface, the truth lingers, messy, human, and uncomfortably real. Henry VIII's death was not the heroic finale history wanted to remember. It was a grim reminder of the limits of power and the inevitability of decay, stories carefully veiled by those who inherited his throne and legacy. Henry VIII's life commanded armies, altered religions, and reshaped a nation. But his death speaks of something far more universal: decay, memory, and the limits of power. No crown, no throne, no decree can escape the final judgment of mortality. The grotesque end of a king known for his might reveals a truth that resonates across time: power is fleeting, flesh is fragile, and death is the great equalizer. Henry's death forced England to confront not just the end of a ruler, but the fragility behind the grandeur. It marked the beginning of a new era, yet carried the shadows of his personal suffering and human vulnerability. His legacy remains a mirror, reflecting the eternal dance between human ambition and mortality, where even the most formidable fall, and where the greatest empires are built on bones destined to crumble. As the old Latin saying reminds us, memento mori, remember you must die. In the story of Henry VIII, that reminder rings loud and clear: echoing through history as both warning and reflection.